Star Wars Red Harvest Chapter 1 Ring 3,645 years before the Battle of Yavin. Wim Nictor stood just outside the circle, awaiting first blood. The cold morning air over Dasser Foston tasted like ozone, numbing his tongue and lips, making his heart pound harder in his chest until it actually shook the heavy fabric of his wind-resistant tunic. He had climbed the 77 steps to the top of the temple with the other students, muscles aching, sweat from his exertions still drying in the wind. The lightsaber training session was over, and now the duels would begin. In the 3 standard years since he'd arrived at the academy, Nictor had come to anticipate these duels with a special kind of excitement. A tall, rangy 17-year-old with a thatch of jet black hair, he gazed into the circle with hungry, blue-gray eyes that matched the unforgiving landscape almost perfectly. Nictor looked down. From the top of the temple, the Sith Academy resembled nothing so much as a partially demolished wheel, its spokes radiating crookedly out from the central hub of the tower. Its ancient chambers, enclosed walkways, tunnels, and temples, and the great library that served as its haunted heart had all long ago begun to crumble and deteriorate from decades of accumulated snow and ice, and the constantly shifting tectonic eccentricities of the planetary crust. The result was a sprawling ruin of forgotten spaces, some of them palatial, groaning under tons of age-tortured Sith architecture. It was here that they'd come, Nictor and several hundred others, to learn everything they needed to know about the dark side of the Force. Directly across from him, Lord Shakweth, the Sith Blade Master, took 3 steps forward into the open space, turning to regard the students from beneath the hood of his cloak. For a moment, the wind had fallen still. All was quiet, except for the scrape of his boots across the flat, uneven surface. The Blade Master's stony countenance betrayed no hint of expression. The thin, lipless slit of his mouth never moved. No comment was made, nor was any needed. This was the moment when the first challenge would be made, and Nictor, along with all his peers, had heard the rumors. This was the day that Lusk was going to issue his challenge. Rance Lusk was the Academy's top student, a Sith acolyte of such fierce promise and potential that few, if any, dared approach him, let alone face him in a duel. These days, he spent most of his time in private training sessions with Shakweth and the other masters at the Academy. Some said that he even sat in meditation with Lord Scabrous himself, up in the tower. Although Nictor had his private doubts about this last bit, he hadn't met a student yet who actually claimed to have been inside the tower. Even so, he waited, holding his breath. The group had fallen absolutely silent. A moment later, Lusk stepped forward. He was an agile, muscular figure in a robe and tunic, with a long face and flaming red hair that he'd grown long, pulled back and kept braided so tightly that it pulled on the corners of his pale green eyes, giving them a slightly slanted look. But his most outstanding feature was the self-contained silence that hovered around him like a lethal cloud. To approach him closely was to experience a climate of dull dread. The 1 or 2 times Nictor had accidentally bumped into Lusk in the halls of the Academy, he'd actually felt the temperature drop along with the oxygen content. Lusk emanated menace. he breathed it out like carbon dioxide. Nictor felt his whole body fall still, save his pounding heart as Lusk turned slowly to regard his fellow acolytes with an indifferent, almost reptilian stare. As far as opponents went, there were only a few worthy of his time. Lusk's gaze passed over Jura Ostrogoth, Skopik, Nace, and Ra'at, some of the most skilled duelists in the group. If challenged, Nictor wondered, would any of them accept? The humiliation of backing down was nothing compared to the potential catastrophe of losing to Lusk in the circle. In his hands, even a training blade, with its durasteel shaft and millions of microscopic toxin-filled barbs, could deal out disastrous injury. Lusk stopped, and Nictor realized that the red-haired acolyte was staring at him. Lusk's words hung in the air. I challenge Nictor. At first, Nictor was certain that he'd misheard. Then the reality sank in, and he felt his innards drop, as if the ground itself had abruptly vaporized beneath his feet. Time seemed to have stopped. He was aware of Shockweth and all the other apprentices turning around to look in his direction, waiting for him to step forward or back down. As a purely practical matter, Lusk's selection made no sense. Although he could hold his own in practice, Nictor was clearly the other student's inferior, providing no opportunity to hone his skills or even offer the others a good performance. Still, the challenge hovered in the air between them, unanswered. Well, Nictor, the Blade Master asked, what do you say? Nictor lowered his head, feeling a slow, familiar warmth crawl into his cheeks and neck. He was aware that a formal reply wasn't necessary. Simply bowing his head and stepping back would be answer enough. And a moment later, the whispers would begin as to what little prestige he'd managed to garner here in the last 2 years began to evaporate around him. It was an unwinnable dilemma, of course. But at least this way he would walk away intact. Several of Lusk's previous opponents hadn't been so lucky. The last 3 had left the academy after losing to him. One had taken his own life. It was as if losing to Lusk had done something to them, inflicted some profound inner wound from which there was no recovery. The answer was obvious. Nictor would just step backwards and bow out. And so he was as shocked as any of them when he heard himself say, I accept. The murmur of surprise rippled audibly through the other apprentices. Even Shockweth cocked one thorny eyebrow. Nictor blinked, unable to believe what he'd just said. He hadn't meant to speak at all. The words had bubbled out of him involuntarily. Looking up at Lusk, seeing the slightest hint of a smile curling at the corners of that small, unremarkable mouth, Nictor realized that, of everyone here, only Lusk was unsurprised by his response. And for the first time, Nictor saw what was happening. This wasn't about dueling at all. It was about something else entirely. Well then, Lusk said, beckoning with his free hand. Come on. Before he knew it, Nictor felt himself being sucked forward into the ring, one foot, and then the other, dragging the rest of his body along with it. His heart raced as his body registered that this was actually happening. No, his mind protested, I'm not doing this. I don't want this. But that didn't matter, because all he could see now was Lusk's smile, broadening enough to show a faint yellow glint of canines beneath the lips. Nictor knew what was going on. And what was worse, Lusk knew that he knew. Lusk's eyes were braziers of pure sadistic pleasure, and their intensity transformed this otherwise plain face, distorting it somehow, making it appear horrible. They were face to face now, close enough that Nictor could feel that terrible coldness spilling out of Lusk's pores, and Lusk raised his training blade, its shaft hissing up through the air as he placed himself in standard ready position. "Don't!" Nictor wanted to say, his eyes silently pleading, but instead he saw his own blade go up. It was too late. Whatever was being done to him, whatever Lusk was doing to him, Lusk's blade swung down hard and fast. Nictor reacted instantly, with instinctive speed and agility ingrained from countless practice sessions. Metal struck metal with a clang that shook the air, reverberating through the circle around them and making it hum like a high-voltage circuit. Something snapped to life inside Nictor, and when Lusk came at him again, he was ready, deflecting Lusk's next thrust with a sharp, unhesitating parry and snapping back with a move that suddenly created an opening between them. From what sounded like far away, Nictor heard the crowd let out a slight, appreciative mutter. He'd already outlasted their most pessimistic expectations. Lusk charged forward again, and Nictor sprang to deflect the thrust, less skillfully now. That fleeting sense of competence was already gone, stripped away, replaced by a dizzying loss of perspective. How had he gotten so close, so quickly? Lusk was moving too fast, and Nictor's blade seemed to have come to life all on its own in his hand, jerking and slashing to hold Lusk off, but Lusk's cold smile told the whole story. "I own you, maggot," it said, the strength of the other cadet's will booming through Nictor's skull. "And you will do as you're told." "No!" Nictor's jaw clenched, summoning what remained of his resolve. He understood now that his only hope lay in freeing himself, wresting his will away from Lusk's authority. What the other acolyte was practicing on him now was obviously some advanced force mind control technique learned from one of the Sith Lords at the Academy. Perhaps at the knee of Scabrous himself. Had the rumors of his secret tutelage been true after all? Whatever the case, for reasons known only to Lusk, he decided to try it out this morning on Nictor, and Nictor had nothing to counter with. With an audible grunt of effort, Nictor surged forward again, blade at the ready, only to be met by a bemused smirk of contempt, as if Lusk expected nothing else. In a series of moves, Lusk sequenced seamlessly from a brutal and precise Makashi attack to the more acrobatic Form 4, flipping up from a standing position, spinning mid-air and landing behind Nictor before he'd even had a chance to react. Too late, Nictor heard the blade hiss off to his right, whipping across his elbow, and he let out a sharp, agonized cry as his hand went numb, fingers springing open to release his blade. Helpless, disarmed, he felt the cold tip of Lusk's durasteel come to rest against the back of his neck, biting into the skin just below the base of his skull. There was that awful numb sensation that Nictor knew all too well, the second before the nerve ending registered an overload of pain. At least it was over. Now, Lusk's voice throbbed inside of his head. It was low and toneless, an irresistible command. Push yourself backward onto my blade. Nictor resisted, straining forward, muscles drawing taut in his neck, but it was useless. He couldn't hold back. The pain swelled, doubled back on itself, grew infinitely worse, shrieking through him, and some grim, instinctive part of him knew that he was seconds away from severing his own spinal cord, shorting out his brain and extinguishing all remaining thought in that final instant of consciousness. He sucked air through his teeth and looked out, as if from some great distance, at the faces of the others outside the circle, staring him down. Their eyes were bright and eager, awaiting the inevitable coup de grace. Curse you, Nictor thought. Curse every stinking one of you. I hope you all have to endure this torture, or worse. I hope you each suffer like I am suffering now. I hope. With a gasp, Nictor lurched forward, suddenly free, away from the blade, reaching up to place one hand over the painful but ultimately superficial wound it had left just above the bony knob of his vertebral prominence. He could barely manage to keep his hand upright. The battle, both physical and mental, had reduced his body to a blurry hologram of its former self. Muscles trembling, wrung to rags, skin and hair drenched in fresh sweat. His head felt like it was going to explode. He couldn't catch his breath, turning around to face Lusk on legs that seemed as though they might betray him and buckle at any moment. He caught a glimpse of the other acolytes' impenetrable green eyes. You only lived because I let you, those eyes said, and Nictor understood that, in the end, Lusk's act of mercy had sentenced him to a greater humiliation of unwarranted survival. He looked away, turned, and made his way through the crowd. No one spoke or made a sound as he followed the stony steps downward from the top of the temple to the snow-strafed walkway below.